All right, so today we're diving into something pretty big,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure you've heard about it before.
Right.
We're going to be talking about China's one-child policy.
Yeah.
So, this huge social experiment that went on for decades,
Mm-hmm.
and we're still seeing the consequences of today.
Yeah, definitely.
And we've got this super interesting research article from 1999
Right.
that really gets into the details of how this policy was put into practice,
Right.
what challenges it ran into,
Yeah.
and of course, all the criticisms that it got.
Of course.
So you ready to jump in?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's do it.
It's really important to understand the context here.
Okay.
We're talking about China back in the late 70s,
Right.
a country that was dealing with this massive population boom.
Okay.
And that was putting a lot of pressure on its resources
Yeah.
and on their plans for development.
I mean, it's hard to imagine now, isn't it?
Yeah, kind of.
Because there was a time when China actually thought a big population was a good thing. Remember that famous quote from Mao Zedong?
Yeah.
Of all things in the world, people are the most precious.
Exactly. Yeah,
Things sure changed a lot.
they really did.
It's interesting how that whole way of thinking shifted.
Yeah,
And I think that's key to understanding this whole policy, right?
absolutely.
I think the 1982 census was a big turning point.
Yeah.
The numbers just showed that softer approaches,
Right.
like encouraging people to get married later or
Oh, yeah.
space out their kids,
Right.
that wasn't going to be enough.
Yeah.
The government really felt like they needed to do something drastic
Mm.
to meet their goals for population control.
Yeah, they felt like they needed to get those numbers down
Exactly.
one way or another.
Yeah, and that's where the one-child policy comes in.
You're right.
But what's interesting is, and what this research really brings out,
Yeah.
is that this policy wasn't this fixed, unchangeable thing
Right.
applied the same way everywhere.
Yeah.
It actually varied a lot, depending on where you were and what you were talking about.
Exactly.
So there's a lot of nuance there.
Absolutely.
One of the biggest divides was between urban and rural areas.
Yeah, for sure.
So in cities, people often relied on state sector jobs.
Right.
They lived in limited housing. They had better access to things like healthcare, education.
Right.
So they really felt the pressure of a growing population
Absolutely. They felt the squeeze.
much more directly.
Yeah.
But out in the rural areas,
Yeah.
things were way different.
Totally different situation.
Think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Families relied on their children,
Right.
especially sons,
Yeah.
for support in their old age.
Absolutely.
Infant mortality was higher.
Right.
And there was a lot of distrust towards government policies.
Of course, especially after years of political upheaval.
Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there.
That's true.
And this research actually talks about how people in these villages became really good at working the system.
Yeah.
They'd negotiate with the local authorities,
Mm-hmm.
find loopholes,
Mm-hmm.
basically bargain their way
Correct.
into bending the rules.
It's amazing how adaptable people can be
It really is.
when they need to be.
There's this one story in the article that really stuck with me.
Oh, yeah.
It talks about how these villagers would actually barter with officials
Wow.
to have more children.
That's incredible.
It just really brings home that human element.
Right.
This was this grand social experiment,
Mhm.
but these weren't just statistics.
Yeah.
These were real people
Real families.
making incredibly tough choices
Absolutely.
under some really extraordinary circumstances.
Yeah, it's hard to even imagine.
For sure.
It's important to remember that these choices were being made
Yeah.
against the backdrop of these massive economic reforms.
Oh, yeah, the economic reforms in the 80s and 90s?
Exactly.
Because those reforms didn't just happen in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
They had a huge impact on how this whole one-child policy played out
Absolutely.
on the ground,
For sure.
One of the biggest things was this huge boom in internal migration.
Hmm.
People were moving all over the place,
Yeah.
looking for new opportunities,
Right.
and that made it super difficult
Yeah.
to keep track of births,
Right.
enforce the policy.
Yeah. How do you even track people when they're moving that much?
Exactly. It became a logistical nightmare.
Yeah, for sure.
And then with all these private businesses popping up,
Mm-hmm.
people were less reliant on the state
Right.
for their livelihood.
Yeah. They didn't need the government jobs as much anymore.
So the government lost a lot of its leverage
Right.
to enforce this policy.
They couldn't really hold jobs over people's heads anymore.
Exactly. It just wasn't as effective.
No.
And then as incomes went up,
Mhm.
especially in those rural areas,
Right.
the fines for having more kids just became less of a deterrent.
Yeah.
People could just afford to pay them. Some even saw it as an investment
Mm-hmm.
in their future.
Yeah, like it was worth the cost.
It's amazing how these economic changes
Yeah.
basically chipped away at the whole foundation of this one-child policy,
Right.
even if it wasn't intentional.
Yeah, definitely unintentional.
But there's another consequence of these changes that really stood out to me in this research.
Mm-hmm.
Underreporting of births,
Oh, wow.
especially of girls.
Right.
And it seems like this not only messed with the population data,
Mm-hmm.
but it might have even contributed
Yeah.
to that rising sex ratio imbalance
Right. Right.
at birth.
Yeah, that's a big one.
It makes you think, like, if you can't even accurately measure the impact of a policy,
Right.
how can you really judge
Yeah.
if it was successful or not?
Exactly. It's a fundamental problem
For sure.
with any kind of social engineering like this.
We're starting to see some of those unintended consequences here.
Yeah,
And things are going to get even more complicated. Oh, for sure.
as we start looking at the social and ethical side
Absolutely.
of this one-child policy.
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting,
Right.
for sure.
Buckle up.
Yeah, we're just getting started.
All right, so we've talked about the background of the one-child policy
Mm-hmm.
and how putting it into practice wasn't as clear-cut as some people might think.
Right, definitely.
But now let's get to the really important stuff,
Okay.
the social and ethical implications.
Right.
There's no denying that this policy sparked a ton of controversy.
Oh, absolutely.
And this research article doesn't shy away from that at all.
Nope.
One of the most troubling outcomes
Mm-hmm.
was the increase in sex-selective abortions
Yeah.
and the abandonment of baby girls.
Right.
The cultural preference for sons.
Yeah, especially in rural areas.
Really clashed with the restrictions of the policy.
Yeah, head on.
It's just heartbreaking to think about.
It really is.
The article even connects this desire for sons
Yeah.
to a rise in female suicide rates.
Oh, wow. During the years when the policy was most strictly enforced,
That's awful.
it makes you think about all that pressure
Mm-hmm.
and despair that women must have felt in
Absolutely.
those circumstances.
It's a truly tragic outcome.
It is.
And it just underscores the human cost
Yeah.
of this policy.
And it feeds into a lot of the criticism saying that it placed this unfair burden on women,
Absolutely.
both physically and emotionally.
Yes, both.
It's clear this policy had some deep and often unintended
Mm.
social impacts,
Yeah.
but it also brings up a bigger question.
Okay.
How do you even measure the success or failure
Right.
of a policy this complex and far-reaching?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
On one hand, the policy did manage to curb population growth.
Okay.
Some estimates say it prevented as many as 400 million births,
Wow.
which eased the strain on resources
Right.
and maybe even helped China's rapid economic development.
So, purely from a numbers standpoint, you would say it was a success.
Yeah, you could.
But then you have the flip side,
Right.
all those social and ethical costs
Okay,
that
we
we've
could-
been talking about.
The skewed sex ratio,
Yeah.
human rights concerns,
Yeah.
the emotional toll on families.
Yeah.
These are all part of the picture, too.
And those factors are still at play today.
Right.
Even after the policy officially ended in 2016,
Absolutely. They have a long reach.
it's almost like this pendulum swing.
Yeah, like that.
You know, they went from worry about overpopulation to worry about underpopulation.
Right, a complete reversal.
It really shows those long-term and often unforeseen consequences
Mm-hmm.
of messing with such a fundamental part of society.
Absolutely. It's like a ripple effect.
This is where it gets really interesting for me.
Okay, I'm listening.
Because amidst all of this, the research article points out
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of rural families,
Right.
despite the hardships,
Yeah.
eventually came to accept the idea of smaller families. Oh, interesting. As the costs of raising kids went up, and as their hopes for their children's future changed,
Right.
having only one child became less of a burden and more of a practical choice.
Wow, that's a really fascinating observation.
It is, right?
Yeah.
It's a reminder that social change
Mm-hmm.
is rarely straightforward.
Well,
Even when it's driven by top-down policies,
right.
it's influenced by this complex mix of economic factors,
Mm-hmm.
cultural shifts,
Yeah.
individual choices.
That's a whole web of interconnected things. It
Yeah.
really is. It seems like a classic example of unintended consequences,
Yeah.
both good and bad.
But beyond this specific case of China,
Mm-hmm.
what wider lessons can we learn from this experience?
Right.
What can other countries facing population challenges
Yeah.
take away from this one-child policy?
That's a crucial question.
It is.
And I think one of the biggest takeaways
Okay.
is just how important it is to think about the ethical side
Mm-hmm.
of population control measures.
Right.
Any policy that tries to influence family size needs to put individual rights and reproductive freedom first.
Because as we've seen, those heavy-handed approaches can have unintended and often harmful social effects.
Absolutely.
This one-child policy is a stark reminder that policymakers need to be really careful when they're dealing with such personal and fundamental parts of people's lives.
It's a delicate balance.
It really is.
And it's not just about respecting individual rights.
Okay.
It's about recognizing how complex this issue is.
Yeah.
There's no magic solution to managing population.
Every country has its own unique circumstances.
Absolutely.
Its cultural norms, economic realities, demographic trends. What might work in one place could totally backfire in another.
It's about finding that sweet spot between addressing those population concerns and upholding individual liberties.
It's a tightrope walk for sure.
It really is.
It needs careful thought, open discussion, and a willingness to adapt policies as new information comes out. And things change.
Exactly. You have to stay flexible.
So for everyone listening, how can we apply these lessons to our own understanding of population issues?
Good question.
Even beyond China?
Yeah, it's a global issue.
What does this deep dive tell us about how we approach these complex challenges?
It's a lot to think about.
Feels like we've just skimmed the surface here.
Yeah, I think so.
This 1999 research gives us this little glimpse in time, but those ripples from the one-child policy, they are still being felt.
Oh, yeah.
Both in China and around the world.
Absolutely.
It's kind of crazy. We've been talking about it in the past tense. But its legacy is still very much present.
Oh, for sure.
China's current problems, the aging population, shrinking workforce, gender imbalance, all of that's at least partly a result of these decades of strict population control.
It's hard to separate it out.
It makes you wonder, what are the long-term consequences of a policy that really reshaped a society so dramatically?
Yeah, it's a big question.
And how do you even begin to untangle those consequences from all the other things that have shaped China over the past few decades?
Over such a long time.
It's a mess.
It's complicated, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But, you know, I think one thing this deep dive shows is that we need to look at the big picture when we're talking about these population issues. It's not just numbers. It's about people's lives, their choices, their hopes for the future.
And we need to understand that those choices are shaped by so many factors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cultural norms, economic realities, government policies.
You can't just point to one thing and say, that's the cause.
Exactly. It's way more nuanced than that.
It's about recognizing how connected everything is and being humble. Knowing that we don't always have the answers. And even the policies with the best intentions can have consequences we don't expect.
That's such an important point.
It is.
It's easy to think we have all the solutions.
Especially from a distance.
Yeah.
But in reality, there are always trade-offs, unintended consequences, and always more to learn.
Always more to learn.
So keep an open mind.
Yeah, and keep questioning things.
Absolutely.
So, to everyone listening out there.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with this.
Okay, hit us with it.
How do you think governments should balance the need to manage population with protecting individual rights and freedoms?
Yeah. It's a tough question.
It really is.
With no easy answers. No, not at all.
But it's a question worth thinking about.
Yeah, it's important.
Because the choices we make today have consequences for generations to come.
Absolutely. It's about the future.
So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
We'll see you next time.